The early Cretaceous of southern England was a land ruled by an astonishing diversity of unique and fascinating dinosaurs. And very recently, a particularly bizarre-looking herbivore was described from its most dinosaur-rich rock layers, the Wessex Formation on the Isle of Wight. As someone who grew up fossil hunting on the Isle of Wight, and who did my undergraduate research project on the paleo environments of the early Cretaceous on the island, any discovery from this place holds a special place of interest in my heart, and this is one of the most exciting and interesting we've had in a long time. But first, I'm going to provide some background. The spectacular animal we're going to be talking about in this video was pulled out of the Wessex Formation, and the Wessex Formation is believed to have been deposited in the Barremian stage of the late Cretaceous, dating to around 125 to 121 million years ago. As discussed in this paper on the dinosaur footprints of the Isle of Wight, the oldest deposits in this formation might have actually been deposited in the earlier Hautaverian stage. During this time, Europe was a series of islands surrounded by warm, shallow seas. The transition from the Barremian to the later Aptian-aged rocks occurs in the overlying Vectis Formation, which I studied in my undergraduate dissertation. And throughout the entire sequence of the Wessex Formation, going into the Vectis Formation and then into the Adderfield Clay Formation, there's a very interesting environmental shift from a floodplain with forests to a beach to an intermittently closed and open lagoon environment that was sometimes freshwater and sometimes marine. And eventually the sea levels rose and claimed this coastal region, giving way to mudstones and eventually chalk as the entire landmass was slowly claimed by the sea and all the dinosaurs on it lost to the waves. But long before that happened, the island that would become southern England was host to an immense diversity of dinosaurs. And the most abundant group of large herbivores on this island were the Iguanodontians. The Wessex Formation has already yielded the bulky, spike-handed Iguanodon, the slightly less bulky Mantellosaurus, and the gloriously big-nosed Bristonius comes from the overlying Vectis Formation. And now, a new Iguanodontian has been described. So, I'd like you all to put your hands together and cheer on our new Iguanodontian, Comptonatus chasei. The name Comptonatus comes from Compton Beach, the site where the specimen was discovered, which coincidentally was also one of the sites for my undergraduate project, and Tonatus, which is Latin for thundered. The species name chasei comes from the late great fossil hunter Nick Chase, who discovered the skeleton. I feel like I need to talk a bit about Nick Chase and the study's lead author, Jeremy Lockwood, before I start, because Jeremy is someone I've met on several occasions, and Nick Chase is someone I once knew. When I was doing my undergraduate fieldwork in the Vectis Formation in 2015, I was conducting gamma-ray spectroscopy on the rock faces to try to get an idea of the changes in environmental humidity going from the Barremian into Oceanic Anoxic Event 1A, and Nick Chase came up to me to say hello and see what I was doing. On a later visit, I would meet both of them together, and they would both express interest in the work I was doing. At the time, I was doing this at two sites, Adderfield and Brook, and Nick was searching for pieces of a sauropod that had been, according to him, slowly eroding out of the cliff. And he was walking along the Brook Beach to Compton Beach walk on a daily basis at the time to try to get as many pieces of this eroding out sauropod as was possible. I genuinely don't think I've ever encountered a fossil hunting fanatic as dedicated to paleontological discovery as Nick Chase, and he discovered a lot of dinosaur remains, pretty much all of which he donated to the Dinosaur Isle Museum, so that scientists could study them and the general public could learn about them. We met each other many times during the weeks I was doing my fieldwork, and he shared his vast knowledge of the rocks I was studying with me and pointed out a couple of horizons that he'd previously found that included cross-sections of dinosaur footprints in the Vectis Formation. He also discussed the anatomical features of different vertebrae that you can use to tell which reptile groups they came from, knowledge which sadly fell straight out of my head. In 2018, Nick won the Mary Anning Award for Amateur Paleontologists from the Paleontological Association, and very deservedly so in my opinion. He passed away in 2019, and I didn't find this out until quite a few years later. I will admit I was quite saddened, as I had hoped to get a chance to actively join him on some fossil hunting expeditions. Nick Chase is someone who helped greatly expand my knowledge of island geology and paleontology, and I was very sad to learn of his passing. Last year, when I was back in the UK, I and my fellow paleontology nerd friends James and Edward went on some fossil hunting trips at that beach, and both times to me it felt like it was missing someone. It was strange visiting that site and knowing I wasn't going to see Nick there, because he felt like a fixture of the beach at that point. Now, I don't know how much more, if any more, of that sauropod he was searching for he found, but he did find the almost complete remains of Comptonatus around 2 years before I met him. Whilst I was on these trips with James and Edward, I found these casts of Iguanodontian footprints, some of which may have even been made by Comptonatus. Now, as I mentioned, Jeremy Lockwood accompanied Nick Chase a couple of these times, and I met him during this fieldwork. And I also met Jeremy Lockwood a few years later on a Dinosaur Isle fossil walk, where we caught up and discussed a little bit of the stuff he'd been working on. I will admit that I don't know Jeremy super well, but he's always been a fascinating person to talk to, and I've been very interested in the work he's been doing on the island's Iguanodontians. When I first met him, he was undertaking his PhD, I believe at the University of Portsmouth, after retiring from his former life as a medical doctor and longing to pursue his true passion as a vertebrate paleontologist. Jeremy's expertise in human skeletal anatomy gave him a huge head start in understanding the anatomy of dinosaurs, as well as a keen, masterful eye for detail for noticing differences in skeletal features between taxa that other paleontologists had missed, which led to his description of Bristonius a few years ago. Anyway, onto the paper. Jeremy Lockwood is joined as a writer on this paper by two co-authors. The first is enemy of the channel, Professor Dave Martill, and the second is prolific paleontological legend Susanna Maidment, who is the only author of this paper I've never met, but has done a ton of great research and was a paleontological advisor on Prehistoric Planet, so is very cool in my book. Now, as we've said, this new dinosaur was a member of a lineage called the Iguanodontia, a group which lived from the late Middle Jurassic until the very end of the Cretaceous, and which were the dominant large herbivores throughout most of the Cretaceous period, though they did have their smaller members. This group was actually one of the first groups of dinosaurs that scientists ever knew about, since Iguanodontian remains were first described by Gideon Mantell in 1824 from material from Sussex. Now, Gideon noticed similarities between the teeth of what he would name Iguanodon and those of an iguana, hence the name Iguanodon or iguana tooth, and he basically interpreted this animal as being a giant iguana. The thumb spikes that many members of this group possessed were also something that he interpreted to be a nose horn. For a very long time, paleontologists had an annoying tendency to name just about any Barremian to Aptian age large Iguanodontians in Europe as being specimens of Iguanodon bernisatensis or of Mantellosaurus atherfieldensis, which led to their true diversity during this time period being vastly underestimated. There are also a ton of seemingly dubious dinosaur genera and species named from non-diagnostic material, like Vectisaurus, Sphenospondylus, and Iguanodon coelii that also got named. There was, as I just mentioned, Iguanodon atherfieldensis, which is now recognized as actually being distinct enough to be in its own genus, Mantellosaurus, which I remember as a child being told was actually probably more closely related to the African Oranosaurus than to Iguanodon proper, but the taxonomic nightmare of early Cretaceous Iguanodontians is, well, it's just that, a taxonomic nightmare, and confounded by the fact that getting enough material to be diagnostic in a lot of the related taxa is nowhere near as easy as we'd like. Now, normally when I talk about a new dinosaur discovery, I'll detail all of the bones that were found of the animal. But in this case, the skeleton was so wonderfully almost complete that it would probably be easier to show you what was missing than what was actually found. When this almost complete skeleton is put together into a skeletal diagram, as done here by the incredible Skye McDavid, we see that the animal had a very unique, distinctive, sort of deep parallelogram-shaped torso, which sadly hasn't really been accurately shown in any paleo art I've seen of the animal so far, likely because prior to my commissioning this illustration, we didn't actually have a full-on scaled skeletal reconstruction of it to make a good piece of artwork from. And here's where this video gets tricky for me writing it, because this paper goes into so much detail with how every single bone compares with those of other Iguanodontians that I think it's best for me to just leave the paper in the description so that you can read all of that for yourself. This is, after all, the most complete dinosaur skeleton found in the UK in over 100 years. Needless to say, the paper is very interesting and extremely thorough, and if I covered even a quarter of it, we would be here for hours, and the algorithm would murder this video, and you might get bored out of your minds. So, let's talk about a few interesting things that Lockwood et al. Found in the specimen. First, let's take a look at this thin section that they took of the animal's ribs to get an idea of roughly how mature the animal was and how old it was. To do this, they had a look for lines of arrested growth. Lines of arrested growth, by the way, are lines of increased bone density that reflect pauses in bone development, which relate to seasonal changes in the animal's growth rate due to there being a seasonal variability in the amount of food supply. The rib of the Comptonatus holotype contains 5 visible lines of arrested growth, meaning that the animal was at least 5 years old when it died. I say at least because, based on prior work with Hypacrosaurus, Iguanodontian rib bones seem to sometimes show less lines of arrested growth than the femurs, so this animal might have actually been a few years older than that. Based on the bone histology, compared with its American relative Maiasaura, the authors interpreted that the animal hadn't finished growing, so could have got a lot bigger than the 5.5 meters that this particular animal reached when it died, and they estimate that it had reached sexual maturity. So how did this animal live? Well, since lots of Iguanodontian footprints are often found on the same rock horizons together at Compton Beach, these animals seem to have travelled and lived together in reasonably sized herds. Since the remains of this animal were found in floodplain deposits, it's not entirely clear if it was mainly eating the wetland plants of the floodplain or if it was mainly feeding on the plants in the forested areas, and the animal was caught up in a flood and then dragged into the floodplain. Only a few teeth were present, but their teeth seemed to be more similar in shape to those of other European early Cretaceous Iguanodontians and to the African Oranosaurus than to any of the younger or more derived members of the group. Despite these similar teeth, Comptonatus, Bristonius, and Mantellosaurus all have very different mouth shapes, which is interesting because it seems to indicate that they probably had different feeding styles, so might have specialized in different plants to avoid competition. Now, Comptonatus is quite important to our understanding of Iguanodontian evolution, as the group transitioned from small bipedal animals in the late Jurassic to large herbivores during the early Cretaceous. And this particular animal is a few million years older than the other well-represented large Iguanodontian from the island, Mantellosaurus. So it's at a key point evolutionarily. In an interview that Lockwood and Professor Martill conducted over on Benji Thomas's channel, Jeremy pointed out that we have a large amount of material from the island deposited over a time span of several million years that are all currently assigned to Mantellosaurus, but probably really represent a number of not yet described Iguanodontians, and we might actually have an evolutionary sequence somewhere in these rocks. But we might also instead have a series of animals, the descendants and ancestors of which, and potentially these exact taxa of which, might have lived alongside each other in much the same way that floodplains in Africa contain a large diversity of large mammals. So, with all this in mind, who was Comptonatus most closely related to? Well, when Lockwood and Co. tallied up all of the traits from the bones of this animal, alongside a huge boatload of other Iguanodontians, they found that it lies just outside of the Hadrosauriformes group, which contains the hadrosaurs and the island's honky-nosed Bristonius, in a monophyletic clade referred to as the Iguanodontidae. In this clade, it is more closely related to the gracile Mantellosaurus and the much older genus Beryllium from early Cretaceous Sussex than it is to Iguanodon. This phylogeny interestingly places Mantellosaurus as more closely related to Iguanodon than to Oranosaurus, which is different from what I've seen in other studies, and they recover Oranosaurus as lying just outside the Iguanodontidae. That said, Lockwood et al. Note that the family Iguanodontidae and the fine details of these relationships are only weakly supported by the phylogenetic analysis, so hopefully more specimens and further analysis can help resolve this. Given its weird, boxy parallelogram proportion and tall neural spines, Comptonatus is a pretty instantly recognizable animal, which hopefully has the potential to become a new icon of British paleontology, especially if the new Walking with Dinosaurs series covers it, which I really hope they do, since we know that the series is going to be looking at the lives of excellent specimens of animals that were being worked on by scientists at the time of the show's production. And frankly, you don't get much more of an excellent specimen of a dinosaur than this, and also it would be a huge missed opportunity for the show not to highlight British dinosaurs, especially in a formation as diverse as this. So, now that we've learnt a little bit about Comptonatus, what kinds of animals did it live alongside, and if we hopefully get a Walking with Dinosaurs episode about this animal, which I really hope we do, what other critters might we see in it? Well, the Wessex Formation contains turtles, a whole host of cool Neosuchians, the pterosaurs Corkycephalus, Istiodactylus, Uctendactylus, and Whitea, the ankylosaurs Polacanthus and Vectipelta, the Hypsilophodontids Hypsilophodon and Vectidromius, the aforementioned Iguanodontians Iguanodon and Bristonius, an assortment of sauropods including Rhybachisaurids and Titanosauriforms, the Compsognathids Aristosuchus and Calamosaurus, the possible Oviraptorosaur Calamospondylus, the Spinosaurids Ceratasucops and Riparovenator, the Tyrannosauroid Eotyrannus, which I'll be making a video on sometime in the next few months, the Carcharodontosaur Neovenator, which I'll also be making a video on in the next few months and is my favourite dinosaur of all time, the mysterious Maniraptoran Yabalandia, which we used to think was a pachycephalosaur, and the dromaeosaurs Vectoraptor and Ornithodesmus. Interestingly, as discussed in this paper by Darren Naish and Dave Martill, which I've linked in the description, there are apparently also very large dromaeosaur teeth from this formation as well, indicating an as yet undiscovered species roughly on par with the giant Utahraptor in size. Here's hoping someone finds that soon.
Hi everyone, it's time for that part of the video that, according to this one commenter, nobody likes and everyone hates and thinks is annoying filler. I'm gonna do it anyway. It's time for our weekly game of Rockman. What's Rockman? This is Rockman. Rockman is the sentient weapon which I shall use to take over the world. These letters are a geological phrase which also acts as the summoning spell for Rockman. Can you guess these letters before Rockman is complete? If you can, then you can prevent the rise of Rockman and save the world from me. But if you guess the letter wrong, another rock goes on Rockman. The most upvoted letter in the last episode was G. So, is G on the board, or is another rock going on Rockman? Sadly for me, another G is going on the board, which means you guys are massively winning by the looks of things. But can you prevent the rise of Rockman? Put your guesses in the comments below for the next letter and find out in the next video if you got it right or wrong.
And with that, I'm off. For now, I'm going to be solidly focusing on my video discussing the pseudoscience of Jordan Peterson. But whilst I focus on that, there will be a couple of short videos coming out. The first will be an addendum to my video on Andre Leonard's plagiarism, since the situation is much more complicated than I initially realized during my research for the first video regarding the conditions under which illustrators for dinosaur books are put, and the fact that a lot of the artwork I found was misattributed by me due to other people online taking credit for work by other people, which is deeply unfortunate. This seems to be a problem with stock photo sites where people will take credit for someone else's artwork in order to sell it as theirs. The second video that's going to be a short one coming out, and I'm not sure if this one will come out before or after that one, is going to be my 1,500 subscriber special, which is going to be looking at you guys' best and worst comments on my videos so far, and having a little bit of fun at both my and your expense. After that, it's up to my patrons which video I make next, so support me on Patreon if you want to vote on that. Remember that patrons get this video a day early. And once again, huge thank you to my patrons Jean and Eric Feenstra, and an extra special shout out to Sky McDavid for her wonderful skeletal that she did for this video. I hope you all have an absolutely wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next time.